They said it was untouchable. They said it was a monument to power, a floating fortress built to dominate and intimidate, a symbol of a navy that believed itself invincible. It carried with it not only the weight of steel and armaments, but the weight of assumptions, the hubris of those who believe that money, technology, and reputation alone can bend reality to their will. The warship was more than a vessel, it was a statement. Its very presence was designed to send a message. We are untouchable, we are unchallenged, and anyone who dares oppose us will pay a price. And for a time it worked. The world looked at it and saw a machine of certainty, a colossus whose mere movement commanded attention, whose presence reshaped strategy, whose name was whispered with caution. It seemed as if the narrative had already been written. Victory had been assumed before a single shot was fired, and intimidation had been codified as inevitability. But the world does not respond to assumptions. History does not bend to arrogance. Empires, no matter how large, no matter how disciplined, have always been brought low by the very certainty they mistake for permanence. And in the waters of the Black Sea, this principle unfolded in a moment that would leave reverberations far beyond its immediate impact. That billion-dollar warship, that symbol of dominance, met a force that it could not see, a strategy it could not anticipate, a people whose resolve outweighed the fear it was meant to inspire. It was a collision not merely of weaponry, but of perception against reality, a confrontation between the arrogance of assumed invincibility and the clarity of purpose that cannot be measured in tons or dollars. The collapse of this myth did not begin with a missile strike, though that was the moment that captured the world's attention. It began long before the warship even entered the theater of conflict. It began in the psychology of overconfidence, in the belief that technological superiority is synonymous with absolute security. It began in the quiet assumption that opposition could be neutralized, that resistance could be predicted, that the presence of immense firepower was itself a sufficient deterrent. They did not account for ingenuity, for adaptability, for the way a small, determined force could exploit the blind spots left by arrogance. They did not account for history repeating itself in subtle forms, for the recurring truth that every fortress carries within it the seeds of vulnerability, that no matter how formidable, no system is perfect, no design is beyond compromise, and no power can ignore the consequences of underestimating an opponent. And when the strike came, it was not just the vessel that sank, it was an idea, a belief, a narrative that had been constructed over years and reinforced by every victory, every display of control, every carefully orchestrated exercise of authority. The warship's destruction was a visual and visceral reminder that symbols, no matter how grand, are ultimately mortal. The billion-dollar label, the engineering marvel, the threat that had loomed over Ukraine's coastline, all of it became evidence that what humans build to intimidate can also become a monument to miscalculation. In the span of moments, the untouchable became vulnerable, the feared became fallible, and the myth that power alone guarantees dominance dissolved beneath the waves. Those who relied on the vessel as proof of their supremacy were forced to confront a reality that had been patiently waiting, unobserved, for the right moment to make itself known. That no fortress is absolute, no machine can shield arrogance from consequence, and no empire can ignore the ingenuity of those who fight with conviction. This collapse of invincibility was not only strategic but profoundly psychological. For decades, symbols of power have been used to control perception. Tanks, missiles, warships, and fleets are more than tools of combat. They are instruments of intimidation, a way to project certainty and suppress doubt. The warship had been designed to serve this purpose at the highest level. Its mere presence was meant to shape decisions, to guide the behavior of opponents not by engagement but by fear, to impose dominance without firing a shot. And for a time, it did exactly that. Commanders assumed superiority would compel compliance. Analysts projected deterrence as though it were a law of nature, and the world watched, largely convinced that such a force was untouchable. Yet confidence built solely on perception is fragile, for it depends not on reality, but on the belief that no one can challenge the narrative. And narratives, no matter how entrenched, can be dismantled with a single act of audacity executed with precision. The event itself was cinematic in its clarity. From the moment the first strike was launched to the instant the warship succumbed, the illusion of invulnerability was stripped away layer by layer. The billion-dollar symbol of dominance, once a floating icon of control, became an emblem of vulnerability. Analysts, strategists, and observers around the world were forced to recalibrate their assumptions, to acknowledge that even the most formidable defenses could be overcome when ingenuity, planning, and determination are applied effectively. The vessel, designed to dominate and project invincibility, had instead revealed a fundamental truth about conflict: that size and cost alone do not dictate outcomes, that overconfidence can blind even the most sophisticated military apparatus, and that the assumption of permanence is a dangerous gamble. In the aftermath, the lessons extend far beyond the battlefield. The collapse of the myth of invincibility is a reminder that power without humility is always at risk. The warship's destruction was a signal to those who measure influence in billions, who equate technology with certainty, who equate size with control. It underscored a principle that has echoed throughout history: that every great power can be humbled, that symbols of authority can fall, that even the strongest can be undone by their failure to recognize the intelligence, creativity, and resilience of those they seek to dominate. The billion-dollar warship was supposed to be untouchable, and in that expectation lay the arrogance that made its loss not only possible but inevitable once faced with a determined and resourceful adversary. The collapse of invincibility also transforms how conflicts are perceived. It changes calculations at command tables, it alters strategies on maps, it reshapes assumptions about what is possible. The warship was a test of perception as much as a test of military capability, and its destruction recalibrated the balance not just in tactical terms, but in psychological and strategic dimensions. Commanders and decision-makers around the globe were reminded that symbols can be illusions, that confidence is not permanence, and that even the most advanced systems can be rendered vulnerable when the right factors converge. For opponents, it is a call to vigilance. For allies, a lesson in the limits of intimidation. For the world at large, a reminder that certainty is always provisional and that invincibility exists only in the imagination of those who refuse to see their vulnerabilities. Moreover, the moment revealed the subtle ways arrogance and assumption interact with reality. When power is assumed to be absolute, it breeds complacency. Systems are built with blind spots, precautions are neglected, responses are delayed. The warship's invincibility was not inherent in its design, but perceived in the minds of those who believed it could not be challenged. And perception, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is vulnerable to disruption. A single miscalculation, a single act of defiance, a single moment of insight can dismantle the most formidable constructs. The billion-dollar vessel, a marvel in its own right, had been rendered powerless not by inferior technology, but by the fatal assumption that no one could exploit its vulnerabilities. Its loss stands as a testament to the truth that arrogance is a far more dangerous enemy than any missile, that hubris can sink giants faster than any weapon, and that invincibility is an illusion that waits only for the right strike to vanish. This collapse also reinforces the principle that symbols are not immutable. A ship, a tank, a fortress, a fleet, these are not eternal. They are instruments whose meaning is constructed through perception and expectation. The warship carried within it a narrative of dominance, a story told through design, positioning, and historical precedent. But narratives, like all human constructs, are fragile. They are susceptible to disruption, redefinition, and reversal. When the strike struck, it rewrote the story in an instant. What was meant to convey superiority now conveyed vulnerability. What was meant to impose fear now inspired reflection and adaptation. The billion-dollar warship had become a cautionary tale, a symbol not of power but of the cost of overconfidence, a lesson in how easily myths of invincibility can collapse when challenged by clarity, courage, and precision. Finally, the collapse of this myth resonates far beyond military strategy. It touches on human nature, on the psychology of power, on the timeless lesson that no position is unassailable when the elements of ingenuity, determination, and strategy converge. The warship's destruction serves as a reminder that the measure of strength is not in the assumption of permanence, not in the grandeur of symbols, and not in the magnitude of resources. True power is tested in moments of vulnerability, in the ability to respond to challenges, and in the awareness that no fortress, no matter how grand, is immune to the consequences of miscalculation. The billion-dollar warship was a lesson etched in steel, fire, and water, a vivid demonstration that invincibility is always provisional, that hubris invites reckoning, and that myths, no matter how carefully constructed, can collapse when faced with reality. In warfare, the loudest weapons do not always win. The largest fleets, the most expensive missiles, the heaviest armor, these are tools, but they are not the deciding factor. What Ukraine demonstrated in the strike against the billion-dollar warship was that purpose and intelligence, when combined, can outweigh sheer size and brute force. This was not an act of luck or reckless audacity. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, a convergence of strategy, insight, and resolve. It was a statement that modern conflict favors the mind that sees clearly over the muscle that strikes blindly, that precision can dismantle intimidation, and that determination, when focused, becomes a force multiplier beyond calculation. From the outset, Ukraine faced an opponent whose material superiority was unquestionable. Every measure seemed to favor the larger power. More ships, more weapons, more funding, more support, more experience. On paper, it was a contest in which Ukraine should have been at a disadvantage, where hope would have been measured in percentages and margins, where a single misstep could have meant disaster. But war, as history has repeatedly shown, is not decided solely by numbers. It is decided by those who can perceive, adapt, and act with clarity when others are blinded by confidence. The strike against the warship was a masterclass in turning limitation into leverage, in demonstrating that intelligence, strategy, and purpose can transform disadvantage into opportunity. Intelligence was the first weapon. Intelligence is more than information, it is understanding. It is the ability to see not just where an enemy is, but where they believe they are safe, where they are exposed, where assumptions create vulnerability. The warship, colossal and imposing, was a fortress on the surface, but beneath the surface, it was not invincible. Every system has gaps. Every formation has a blind spot. Every mind, no matter how trained, has moments of expectation that can be anticipated. Ukraine understood this. It did not merely track the vessel's movement. It analyzed patterns, assessed timing, studied responses, and looked for the smallest openings that could be exploited. It is one thing to have a target. It is another to understand it, to dissect it, to see not what it is meant to represent, but what it actually is in practice. That is the power of intelligence. It turns the overwhelming into the surmountable, the untouchable into the vulnerable, the myth into reality. Purpose was the second weapon. Intelligence alone is sterile without intent, without direction, without clarity of objective. Ukraine's forces were not just operating against a ship. They were operating in defense of a nation, in defense of sovereignty, in defense of the very principle that a smaller power can assert itself against a larger adversary. Every calculation, every maneuver, every decision was informed by a clear understanding of why it mattered, what was at stake, and what the consequences could be. Purpose focuses effort. Purpose sharpens execution. Purpose turns hesitation into action. When combined with intelligence, purpose transforms potential into decisive outcomes. It allows a smaller force to strike like a scalpel rather than a hammer, to act in ways that confound expectation, to achieve what sheer force alone could not. The strike itself illustrates this perfectly. It was not a chaotic barrage. It was not a reckless gamble. It was a measured, precise application of capability against opportunity. Every step had been considered, every potential outcome evaluated, every contingency accounted for. Modern warfare often emphasizes volume, overwhelming power, and the ability to absorb loss. Ukraine demonstrated a different truth, that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one delivered with the exact timing, the exact accuracy, and the exact strategic intention. A single, well-placed strike can accomplish what an entire fleet cannot. It can disrupt, demoralize, and reshape the battlefield in ways that size and expense alone never could. This is the essence of intelligence over brute force. It is the recognition that wars are won not by the weight of steel, but by the clarity of thought, the depth of understanding, and the alignment of action with objective. The warship, despite its billion-dollar design and imposing presence, was vulnerable to those who saw what others did not. It was vulnerable to those who understood not just the mechanics of warfare, but the psychology of command, the patterns of behavior, the expectations that allow prediction and disruption. Intelligence in this sense is both science and art. It is the calculation of risk, the anticipation of movement, and the judgment of opportunity. It is the difference between hitting blindly and striking with certainty. Purpose amplifies this intelligence. Without a reason beyond reaction, intelligence can be wasted. Knowledge without direction becomes inertia. Awareness without commitment becomes indecision. Ukraine's purpose was unambiguous. Every act, every deployment, every signal was in service of the goal, to challenge a force that believed it could impose dominance effortlessly. Purpose directed intelligence. Purpose gave it urgency. Purpose gave it the weight to turn observation into action. It was the force behind the planning, the courage behind execution, and the clarity behind every decision made under pressure. Intelligence provided the map, purpose provided the compass. Together, they transformed calculation into impact, strategy into result, and determination into a decisive moment on the battlefield. The strike was also a demonstration of modern military philosophy. In an era where technology is often equated with superiority, Ukraine reminded the world that thinking matters more than volume, that insight matters more than intimidation, that understanding matters more than hardware. The warship's billion-dollar armor was formidable, but intelligence found its gaps. Its weapon systems were deadly, but analysis revealed patterns and limitations. Its presence was meant to dominate, but clarity of purpose allowed for actions that neutralized that dominance. This is the lesson that echoes far beyond this single engagement. In the modern era, victory is often achieved not by the largest army or the most expensive equipment, but by the smallest force that acts with insight, strategy, and conviction. Adaptation is a key part of this principle. Brute force assumes consistency. Intelligence and purpose exploit change. The warship operated under the assumption that its strength was unassailable, that patterns would remain predictable, and that the psychological impact of its presence would inhibit action. But conflict is dynamic. Situations shift, opportunities arise, weaknesses emerge. Ukraine's success was rooted in observing these changes, anticipating shifts, and reacting with precision. Where sheer power relies on overwhelming, intelligence and purpose rely on observation, timing, and the ability to exploit vulnerability. The smaller force gains advantage not by matching size, but by moving where the larger cannot, by thinking where the larger assumes no challenge exists, and by acting where the larger is least prepared. Furthermore, intelligence and purpose instill resilience. Brute force can dominate in the short term, but it struggles against an opponent who is adaptive, strategic, and focused. The warship may have carried weapons capable of destruction, but it could not anticipate an opponent whose minds were coordinated, whose vision was clear, and whose objective was uncompromising. Purpose underpins morale, sustaining effort in the face of disparity. Intelligence guides efficiency, ensuring effort is applied where it matters most. Together, they create a force multiplier that no amount of steel or missiles alone can replicate. One precise strike can disrupt billions worth of assumed superiority, one well-planned operation can change momentum, and one deliberate act can redefine what is possible for those who appear to be weaker. The psychological impact cannot be understated. To see a supposedly untouchable warship destroyed sends a signal far beyond the immediate battlefield. It demonstrates that intelligence, planning, and clear intent are not merely theoretical advantages. They are practical tools capable of rewriting expectations. For the adversary, it forces recalculation and doubt. For observers and allies, it demonstrates the effectiveness of strategy over intimidation. For those fighting for survival, it inspires courage. This is the hidden power of intelligence combined with purpose. It alters not just the physical situation, but the perception of power itself. Even in broader strategic terms, the lesson is undeniable. The strike redefines how conflict is approached. Brute force can compel compliance, intelligence and purpose can compel reconsideration. Weapons alone can enforce rules, strategy and clarity can reshape them. The warship, despite its enormous investment and physical strength, was defeated not because of inadequacy in weapons, but because the forces opposing it were not limited by assumption. They acted with knowledge, anticipation, and unwavering clarity of goal. They demonstrated that the true currency of warfare is not always metal, but insight. Not always cost, but calculation. Not always size, but the precision and purpose with which action is applied. In this sense, Ukraine's operation is emblematic of a shift in modern conflict. It shows that smaller forces can challenge larger ones when intelligence is applied methodically, when purpose directs effort, and when each decision is grounded in both understanding and objective. It underscores the enduring principle that human cognition, creativity, and determination remain decisive factors even in an age of advanced technology. Size can intimidate, cost can impress, and visibility can command attention, but clarity, strategy, and intent can redefine outcomes. The strike, therefore, was more than a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of philosophy in action. It revealed that preparation, study, and intentionality are as powerful as any weapon system, that the mind and the will can multiply effectiveness far beyond what raw material alone can achieve. It exposed the limitations of relying solely on brute force, and it validated the principle that intelligence, aligned with purpose, transforms potential into decisive accomplishment. The billion-dollar warship may have been a marvel of engineering, but it was ultimately defeated by the human qualities that machines cannot replicate: insight, strategy, anticipation, and resolute intent. And perhaps the most profound implication is this: intelligence and purpose are enduring forces. Weapons rust, ships sink, armies retreat, but the ability to see clearly, to plan thoughtfully, and to act with conviction is a force that endures. It transcends technology, it transcends wealth, and it transcends assumptions about superiority. In the strike against the warship, intelligence and purpose were not just advantages, they were decisive. They leveled the playing field against overwhelming odds. They turned limitation into opportunity. They proved that clarity of mind and strength of will can achieve what size and expenditure alone cannot, and that in the theater of conflict, the greatest weapon is often the one that cannot be measured in billions of dollars or tons of steel. The strike against the warship did more than sink steel and firepower, it shifted the very momentum of the conflict. Victory is not always measured in miles gained or ships destroyed. It is often measured in perception, morale, and the subtle balance of confidence and doubt. When the billion-dollar vessel went down, it sent shockwaves far beyond the Black Sea. Those who had relied on its presence as a symbol of dominance were forced to reconsider their assumptions, to pause in the face of an enemy they had underestimated. For Ukraine, the impact was transformative. A small, precise act of strategy altered the psychological battlefield, proving that even against overwhelming odds, clarity, courage, and coordination could dictate the pace and tone of conflict. Momentum in war is a fragile, shifting force. It is the combination of morale, perception of strength, and the capacity to act decisively. The warship had been intended to project unstoppable power, to assert dominance and intimidate opposition before a single engagement occurred. Its destruction, however, reversed that narrative. Suddenly, the story of inevitability had been rewritten. The giant that had been thought untouchable now appeared fallible, exposed, and beatable. For commanders, strategists, and decision-makers, this created hesitation, uncertainty, and a reassessment of strategy. The psychological advantage once assumed to belong to the larger force had shifted. Momentum, once moving toward intimidation and control, now leaned toward resilience, confidence, and initiative on the side of those previously seen as weaker. The shift was not purely emotional, it was strategic. Morale fuels action. When forces witness that the seemingly impossible is achievable, it changes their willingness to engage, to innovate, and to take calculated risks. Ukraine's ability to strike decisively against the billion-dollar warship inspired a recalibration of effort. a demonstration that intelligence and precision can overturn assumed superiority. Conversely, the adversary was compelled to defend, to reconsider deployment, and to expend resources to reassert control where previously there had been certainty. One moment, one strike, altered the balance of initiative. This psychological and strategic momentum shift also resonates beyond the battlefield itself. It sends a message to allies and observers that determination, strategy, and clarity of purpose can overcome material disparity. It creates confidence that decisions made with intelligence and precision have tangible impact, that restraint, timing, and focus are more powerful than sheer volume. History shows that wars are often decided not by the size of forces alone, but by the side that maintains clarity, initiative, and the ability to capitalize on the opponent's assumptions. The strike against the warship exemplifies this truth. It proves that morale, perception, and psychological positioning are as vital as technology and firepower. One precise action shifted momentum, inspiring courage, demanding reevaluation, and rewriting expectations. In the theater of conflict, momentum is a weapon. And in this instance, intelligence, strategy, and purpose wielded that weapon decisively, turning the tide of perception and opening new possibilities for those who refuse to be intimidated.